Welcome to this explainer. What if the life of just one ancient figure was actually a hidden, encrypted map to thousands of years of history? Today, we're cracking open the foundational text of Genesis, specifically the life of Abraham, and exploring a fascinating hypothesis. Is his personal narrative actually a meticulously crafted blueprint for the entire historical arc of Israel? We're looking at how the source text speculates that Abraham's story is, essentially, a massive textual Easter egg. And we're not just talking about loose thematic similarities here. The proposition argues that if you follow Abraham's journeys, his conflicts, and his family dynamics in the exact order they're presented, you're literally tracing the macro history of Israel from its birth all the way to the apostolic era. Here is our agenda. 1. The blueprint hypothesis. 2. Patriarchal and Mosaic era. 3. Foreshadowing the kingdom era. 4. Exile and restoration. 5. Jesus and apostolic era. 6. The typological summary. Section 1. The blueprint hypothesis. Decoding typology. To really get what the author is doing here, we have to talk about typological prophecy. Basically, it's a pattern where events in one person's life broadly anticipate the future historical events of an entire people. And this isn't totally out of left field for these texts. We see this elsewhere, right? Moses' early trials in Exodus kind of act as a mirror for the larger journey he leads Israel through later. Or think about how Paul's missionary journeys parallel Jesus' preaching tours. The hypothesis is that Abraham serves this exact same function, but on a massive, multi-millennial scale. So here is the macro timeline of historical eras we're going to map directly onto Genesis. We go from patriarchal to Mosaic, into the kingdom period, through the exile, and finally the apostolic era. Keep the sequence in the back of your mind because we're going to watch the chapters of Genesis step through this exact timeline. Section 2. Patriarchal and Mosaic eras, the early journeys. Our source points right to the start of the narrative in Genesis 12. Abram enters the land, hangs out there for a bit, and then boom, he's driven by a famine down into Egypt. While he's there, he's attacked, but the Egyptians get struck with plagues, and ultimately, Abram is driven out with a huge amount of spoil. Think about that. Famine, plagues, leaving with spoil. Sound familiar? The source proposes this personal experience is actually a miniature preview for the national Exodus experience and everything that happens with Joshua centuries later. Then, immediately after that in chapter 13, the timeline shifts to the chaotic period of the Judges. The text maps the civil strife between Abram and his nephew Lot to Israel's national civil strife. Specifically, the source zeroes in on the deliberate mention of Sodom's extreme evil in Genesis 13. This specific detail heavily anticipates the horrific, chaotic events we see way later during the Judges era. Section 3. Foreshadowing the kingdom era, a shift to royalty. Okay, look at this number, 41. The word king pops up a surprising 41 times in Genesis. For a book that's primarily about, nomadic families and patriarchs, this frequency is a massive clue to pay attention to. But here's the crazy part. 27 of those mentions, they are packed tightly into Genesis chapter 14 alone. That is a glaring linguistic signpost pointing straight to the kingdom era. This chapter suddenly shows Abram's unexpected military prowess, treating him like an equal to these regional kings, and it even gives us the very first mention of the city of Jerusalem. According to our source, this firmly establishes a brand new era on our timeline. As we push into chapters 15 and 17, there's a huge plot twist in the promises God makes to Abram. Up until now, the promise was mostly about ministry and a generalized area of land. But suddenly, it expands dramatically. It goes from just land to explicitly including a royal son, and the territory stretches all the way from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. The author argues this perfectly mirrors the later Davidic covenant, matching Israel's political peak under King Solomon, since it was literally only in his days that Israel's territory reached those exact boundaries. Before we leave the kingdom era, the author points out a really complex subpattern with Ishmael, his birth, circumcision, and eventual expulsion. The source calls this a type within a type. It's kind of like a historical Russian nesting doll or the movie Inception. You have a smaller foreshadowing nested deep inside the larger timeline. So these specific events with Ishmael foreshadow the giving of the law, the coming of Jesus, and ultimately the expulsion of old Israel. Section 4. Exile and restoration. Moving into Gentile territory. Moving into Genesis 18 and 19, we see the catastrophic destruction of Sodom. Because the New Testament often links the destruction of Sodom with the judgment of Jerusalem, the author uses this typological link to mark a really tragic end to Israel's Golden Kingdom era. It maps directly to the first destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Following that destruction, Abram spends time living among Gentiles in chapter 20. The source aligns this perfectly with Israel's exile and restoration eras. Just as Israel was displaced and lived in the Gentile oikumene, the known inhabited world, Abram is displaced in Gentile lands. And the beautiful irony here is that even while displaced, they were meant to pray for these Gentiles and be a blessing to them, which is exactly what Abram does. Section 5, Jesus and Apostolic Era, the New Testament Parallels. Now we hit the climax. According to this framework, the birth of Isaac in chapter 21 corresponds typologically to the coming of Jesus. The author notes that Jesus' arrival brings the fullness of the gospel to the Gentiles, bringing life from the dead, much like Isaac's miraculous birth. And naturally, the near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22 links directly and super profoundly to the cross. The timeline keeps mapping perfectly in chapter 23 with the passing of Sarah. The text frames her death, the death of the first matriarch, as a metaphor. It anticipates the closing of Old Israel's chapter with the arrival of the gospel in the New Testament era. Wrapping up this era in chapter 24, we get the story of Abraham's unnamed servant being sent out to find a bride for Isaac. The source asserts this beautifully anticipates the sending of the Spirit in the apostolic era to form and secure a new bride for the Son. So the overarching history of Israel reaches its grand climax right as Abraham's personal narrative wraps up. Section 6. The typological summary. Putting the pieces together. When you step back and look at the blueprint as a whole, it's wild how chapters 12 through 24 systematically snap right into place. You've got the patriarchal era in early chapter 12, the Mosaic era extending through 13, that heavy kingdom era emphasis from 14 to 19, the exile and restoration in 20, and finally, the Jesus and apostolic era closing it all out in chapters 21 through 24. Step by step, the macro history just seems to map directly to the micro narrative. Now, the author of our source text is very upfront that this is a tentative, speculative framework, but they firmly maintain that these patterns are real enough and sequence well enough to invite some serious study and reflection. It is, at the very least, a totally compelling lens through which to view these ancient documents. So, what do you think? Is all of this just a massive, highly speculative coincidence? Or did these ancient authors embed an intricate, deliberate historical blueprint just waiting to be uncovered? That's for you to decide. Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep looking deeper.